What if I told you that one of history's most dramatic escape stories involves mass slavery, divine plagues, and a sea literally splitting in half? And what if this wasn't just ancient mythology, but a foundational narrative that has shaped Western civilization for over 3,000 years? Today we're diving deep into the book of Exodus from the King James Bible, and trust me, this story has more plot twists than any Hollywood blockbuster. We're talking about a tale of oppression so severe it makes dystopian novels look tame, supernatural interventions that defy explanation, and a journey through the wilderness that becomes the ultimate test of faith and survival. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating from a historical perspective. Whether you're religious or not, the Exodus narrative has influenced legal systems, inspired civil rights movements, and provided the framework for countless stories of liberation throughout human history. The very concept of divine justice, the idea that the oppressed will eventually be freed, and the notion of a promised land, all of these trace back to this ancient text. So buckle up, because we're about to explore not just a religious story, but a cultural phenomenon that continues to resonate across every corner of human society today. Our story begins in ancient Egypt, but not the Egypt of pyramids and pharaohs at their peak. This is Egypt several generations after Joseph, the Hebrew who had risen to become second in command and save the nation from famine. The Hebrews had been welcomed as honored guests, but now their descendants face a dramatically different reality. A new pharaoh has risen who doesn't remember Joseph's contributions, and he looks at the growing Hebrew population with deep suspicion. The text tells us the Hebrews have multiplied and become mighty, filling the land. But what looks like blessing to the Hebrews looks like threat to the Egyptians. Fear drives the pharaoh's next moves, and they're calculated and brutal. He enslaves the entire Hebrew population, forcing them into backbreaking labor building storage cities for Egypt's wealth. But slavery alone isn't enough to calm his paranoia. When the Hebrew population continues to grow despite the harsh conditions, he implements a policy so horrific it's hard to comprehend: systematic infanticide. The pharaoh commands Hebrew midwives to kill all male babies at birth. When they refuse, showing remarkable moral courage, he escalates further. Every Hebrew male child is to be thrown into the Nile River. This isn't just oppression anymore, this is attempted genocide. But here's where our story takes its first supernatural turn. A Hebrew woman gives birth to a son and hides him for 3 months. When she can no longer conceal him, she makes a waterproof basket, places her baby inside, and sets him floating on the very river that was supposed to be his grave. In one of history's most ironic twists, this baby is discovered by Pharaoh's own daughter. She recognizes he's a Hebrew child but chooses compassion over compliance with her father's murderous decree. Through his sister's quick thinking, the baby's own mother becomes his nurse, paid by Egyptian royalty to raise her own son. This child grows up as Moses, raised in Pharaoh's palace with the finest education Egypt can provide. But he never forgets his Hebrew identity. When he witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, something snaps. Moses kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand, but his secret doesn't stay hidden. Facing Pharaoh's wrath, Moses flees into the wilderness of Midian, where he becomes a shepherd and starts a family. For 40 years, he lives this quiet pastoral life, probably thinking his days of Egyptian politics are behind him forever. Then comes the moment that changes everything: the burning bush. While tending sheep on Mount Horeb, Moses encounters something impossible. A bush burns with fire but isn't consumed. When he approaches to investigate, he hears a voice claiming to be the God of his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The ground becomes holy, and Moses removes his shoes in reverence and terror. This divine encounter reveals a mission that seems absolutely impossible. God has heard the cries of the Hebrew slaves and chosen Moses to confront Pharaoh and demand their release. Moses, now 80 years old, argues he's not qualified for such a task. He claims he's not eloquent, that people won't believe him, that Pharaoh certainly won't listen. But this divine being provides Moses with miraculous signs. His staff turns into a serpent, his hand becomes leprous and then heals instantly. His brother Aaron is appointed as his spokesman. Moses receives a name for this God, I am that I am, and detailed instructions for his return to Egypt. What follows is one of the most dramatic confrontations between human power and divine authority ever recorded. Moses and Aaron appear before Pharaoh with their impossible demand: "Let my people go." Pharaoh's response is predictably defiant. Not only does he refuse, but he makes the Hebrew slaves' conditions even harsher, forcing them to gather their own straw while maintaining the same brick production quotas. The stage is set for supernatural warfare. God unleashes 10 plagues upon Egypt, each more devastating than the last, designed to demonstrate divine power and break Pharaoh's will. The first plague turns the Nile River to blood. Every fish dies, the water becomes undrinkable, and the stench fills the land. Egyptian magicians managed to replicate this miracle, so Pharaoh remains unmoved. The second plague brings frogs, not just a few, but millions covering every surface in Egypt. They're in beds, ovens, food supplies, everywhere. Again, the magicians duplicate this plague, and Pharaoh's heart stays hardened. The third plague introduces lice or gnats covering every person and animal. This time, the Egyptian magicians fail to replicate the miracle and admit this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh refuses to yield. The pattern continues through swarms of flies, death of livestock, painful boils on humans and animals, devastating hail mixed with fire, locusts that devour everything green, and finally 3 days of absolute darkness so thick it can be felt. Each plague specifically targets Egyptian gods and demonstrates their powerlessness. The Nile was sacred, animals were worshipped, the sun god Ra was supreme, yet all prove helpless against this Hebrew deity. But the most terrible plague is yet to come. Moses announces that at midnight, every firstborn in Egypt will die, from Pharaoh's heir to the slaves' children, even the firstborn of cattle. Only the Hebrew families will be spared if they follow specific instructions involving lamb's blood on their doorposts. This becomes the first Passover, instituted as a permanent memorial. Hebrew families kill spotless lambs, eat the meat with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and mark their doorframes with blood. The destroying angel passes over houses marked with blood, but death strikes everywhere else. The wailing throughout Egypt is unimaginable. Every house has its dead, including Pharaoh's own son. Finally broken, Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron at night and orders them to leave immediately with all their people and possessions. The Exodus begins with approximately 600,000 Hebrew men, plus women, children, and a mixed multitude of other peoples. Biblical scholars estimate between 2 and 3 million people total. They carry Egyptian gold, silver, and clothing, payment for generations of unpaid labor. But Pharaoh's change of heart doesn't last. As the reality of losing his entire slave workforce hits home, he mobilizes his army for pursuit. The Hebrew multitude finds themselves trapped between Pharaoh's approaching chariots and the Red Sea. What happens next defies all natural explanation. Moses stretches his rod over the sea, and strong east winds blow all night, dividing the waters and creating dry ground between towering walls of water. The entire Hebrew nation walks across on dry land. When the Egyptian army follows, pursuing between the walls of water, Moses again stretches out his hand. The waters return with devastating force, drowning Pharaoh's entire army. Not one Egyptian soldier survives. The celebration that follows includes Miriam's song and dancing, but the wilderness journey is just beginning. What starts as triumph soon becomes a series of tests that reveal human nature in all its complexity. Water runs out, and the people complain bitterly. Food becomes scarce, and they actually wish they were back in Egypt where at least they ate regularly. God provides water from rocks and sends manna from heaven daily, along with quail for meat. At Mount Sinai, Moses receives the 10 Commandments and an extensive legal code that becomes the foundation of Hebrew society. But while he's on the mountain for 40 days, the people grow impatient and build a golden calf to worship, breaking their covenant almost immediately. Moses' anger burns so hot he smashes the stone tablets, and divine judgment falls on the idol worshippers. The covenant must be renewed, demonstrating how quickly humans can abandon their highest principles under pressure. The wilderness journey becomes a pattern of divine provision and human faithlessness, of miracles and murmuring, of progress toward the promised land interrupted by rebellion and doubt. What should have been an 11-day journey stretches into 40 years of wandering. The Exodus narrative establishes themes that echo throughout human history: the cry for freedom, the power of faith over fear, the possibility of divine intervention in human affairs, and the long, difficult path from oppression to liberation. Whether understood as literal history, powerful metaphor, or cultural foundation, this ancient story continues to inspire movements for justice and freedom worldwide. The book of Exodus doesn't just tell us about ancient Hebrews escaping Egyptian slavery. It gives us a template for understanding how oppressed peoples can find hope, how tyrants ultimately fall, and how the journey to freedom requires both divine help and human courage. From the American Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, from liberation theology to modern refugee crises, the Exodus story provides language and hope for those seeking freedom from any form of bondage. This ancient narrative reminds us that even the most powerful oppressors cannot ultimately prevail against justice, that freedom is worth any struggle, and that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when human courage meets divine power. The next time you hear someone reference crossing their own Red Sea or wandering in the wilderness, you'll understand they're drawing on one of humanity's most enduring stories of liberation and hope.